Mitchell's teasing voice shattered the quiet in the driveway as he leaned against the passenger door of my car, a playful grin on his face. I glanced up from the driver's seat, where I was wrestling with a stubborn seat belt that seemed determined to stay put. "Very funny," I replied dryly, tugging at the strap once more. It stuck. "I've been at it for 10 minutes. Mitchell chuckled, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. "Move over," he said, swinging the door open and gesturing for me to scoot back. "Let me take care of this before you hurt yourself." I hesitated, unsure about having him so close, but the seatbelt wasn't going to fix itself, and Mitchell had a way of solving problems that left me feeling both thankful and slightly annoyed. "Fine," I relented, shifting back a bit. "But be careful." Before I could finish my warning, he slipped into the car, leaning over me to reach for the seatbelt. The space between us vanished instantly, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of his woodsy cologne enveloping me. His arm brushed against my shoulder as he worked to free the jammed buckle, and I held my breath, suddenly acutely aware of his presence. "Here's your problem," he murmured, his voice low as he tugged at the strap, his face mere inches from mine. When he glanced at me, our eyes locked in a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "You okay?" he asked, his tone softer, almost tentative. I nodded quickly, looking away. "Just hurry up." Mitchell smirked but remained silent, his focus returning to the seat belt. After a few more seconds, he freed it with a satisfying click. "There," he said, leaning back slightly but still close enough for me to feel his presence. "Good as new." "Thanks," I replied, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He didn't move right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable yet charged with something unspoken. My heart raced, and I struggled to pinpoint why. I despised how much I craved to linger in that moment, to let myself lean into him, but I hesitated. "Shouldn't we be heading out?" I asked, trying to inject some lightness into my voice as I glanced at the clock. Mitchell blinked, as if awakening from a daydream, and nodded. "Yeah, let's go." The car ride was unusually quiet. Mitchell typically filled the silence with tales of his day or playful teasing that always made me laugh, but tonight, he seemed lost in thought, gripping the steering wheel a bit too tightly. I wanted to ask him what was bothering him, but fear held me back, fear of his answer and what it might imply. So I stared out the window, pretending not to notice how his eyes flickered toward me now and then, as if he had something to say but couldn't find the words. By the time we arrived at the family gathering, the tension between us had settled into an uncomfortable silence. Mitchell opened my door, his hand brushing against mine as he helped me out of the car. That fleeting touch sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine a moment longer than necessary. "Anytime." As we walked toward the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something I wasn't ready to confront. Later that night, lying in bed, I replayed the moments from the car over and over. The way his arm had brushed against mine, the warmth of his body so close, the intensity in his gaze. Felt overwhelming. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking a simple gesture. But deep down, I knew something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. The next morning, as I was in the midst of tidying up the living room, a knock at the door startled me. My heart raced, an overreaction perhaps, but I couldn't shake the excitement that coursed through me when I opened the door to find him there, a confident smile lighting up his face. "Good morning," he greeted, holding up a paper bag. "Thought you might like some coffee." "Good morning," I replied, attempting to keep my tone steady. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, stepping inside as if he had every right to be there. "I was driving by anyway." I raised an eyebrow but chose to remain silent as I accepted the coffee he offered. I was puzzled by his early visit and the way my chest felt tight with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Mitchell seemed oblivious, or perhaps he was aware but chose to overlook it. He settled onto the couch, stretching out comfortably, and motioned for me to join him. "So, what's on your agenda today?" he asked, his tone relaxed. "Just some cleaning," I replied, taking a seat across from him. "The usual." "You should let me help," he suggested, leaning in slightly. "I don't need help," I shot back quickly. "Maybe not," he said, his voice softening. "But you don't always have to do everything alone." There was a gentleness in his tone, yet it carried a firmness that made my chest tighten further. I looked away, focusing on the coffee cup cradled in my hands. "I'm fine, Mitchell," I said quietly. "Are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question took me by surprise, and when I met his gaze, I found his eyes steady and serious. There was no teasing, no playful charm, just concern. "I'm fine," I repeated, though the words felt empty as they left my lips. The silence that followed hung heavily between us. I found myself grappling with uncertainty, convincing myself that my feelings were mere figments of my imagination, yet the reality was undeniable. Mitchell had transformed from just my late husband's son into someone entirely different. He was kind, charming, and attentive, igniting a spark within me that I hadn't felt in years. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, I couldn't overlook the way he made me feel, vibrant and alive. In the days that followed, it was as if everything was slowly unraveling. Mitchell kept appearing, bringing groceries I hadn't requested, fixing things around the house that didn't really need attention, and lingering just long enough to send my heart racing. He had a knack for filling the silence with effortless conversation, his voice a comforting presence that made the house feel less desolate. But it was those unspoken moments, the lingering looks, the gentle brush of his hand against mine, the way he stood just a bit too close, that made it impossible to deny the growing connection between us. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than his kindness and attentiveness, but deep down I knew the truth. One evening Mitchell called out to me from the driveway. "I'm outside," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "I thought you might want to go for a drive." I was taken aback. "A drive?" he echoed, surprised. "Yeah," he replied. "It's a beautiful night with clear skies. We could head out to the lake." I hesitated, but the thought of being alone in the house felt unbearable. "Give me 5 minutes," I finally said. I ended the call quickly, not wanting to let my thoughts spiral. The drive to the lake was initially serene, with the radio playing softly in the background. Mitchell's grip on the steering wheel was tight, as if he were holding on to something far heavier than the vehicle itself. When we arrived, he turned onto a narrow dirt path that led to a hidden spot by the water. The moon hung low, casting a silvery glow that danced across the lake's surface. Mitchell switched off the engine and leaned back, gazing out at the water. "I used to come here with Dad," he said quietly. "We'd fish and sit by the fire. It was peaceful." I nodded, feeling a tightness in my chest at the mention of his father. "He loved this place," I murmured, my voice barely audible. Mitchell turned to me, his expression unreadable. "So did you," he replied, and the weight of his words lingered between us, making it hard to breathe. I looked away, feeling his steady gaze on me. After a moment, Mitchell stepped out of the truck and walked toward the water. I followed, the cool night air brushing against my skin as I stepped onto the soft grass. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the lake. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice low but resolute. "About what?" I asked, unsure if I wanted to hear the answer. "About you," he replied simply. My heart raced, and I looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "That it's complicated. That it's wrong." He stepped closer, his gaze intense. "But I don't care." I turned to face him, my breath hitching at the fire in his eyes. "You should care," I insisted, my voice shaking. "Why?" he asked, his tone soft yet firm. "Because others might not understand. Because it doesn't fit into a neat little box." "Yes," I replied, the word feeling empty as I spoke it. Mitchell reached for my hand, his touch both gentle and strong. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I shut my eyes, feeling a tightness in my chest as I struggled to muster the strength to deny what was unfolding. Yet the truth loomed large and undeniable. "Yes," I finally confessed, my voice trembling as the weight of my admission hung heavily in the air between us. Mitchell stepped closer, his hand gently brushing my cheek, and in that moment, my defenses began to crumble. "Stop fighting it," he murmured softly. Before I could reconsider, his lips found mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. His hand slid to my waist, drawing me nearer, and I felt myself melt into him. For a fleeting moment, the world around us faded away. There was no guilt, no doubt, no fear. Only the warmth of his touch, the steady beat of his heart against mine, and an overwhelming sense of being truly alive. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my hands gripping his arms as if to anchor myself. Mitchell rested his forehead against mine, his hand still holding me as if he feared letting go. "This is crazy," I whispered, my voice quivering. "Maybe," he replied, his lips brushing my temple. "But it's real." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized he was right. It was real, terrifyingly so. The drive back was quieter than before, with Mitchell's hand resting on the gearshift, his fingers occasionally grazing mine. Each touch made my heart race, yet I didn't pull away. When we arrived at my house, he walked me to the door, his hand lightly placed on my back. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his gaze searching mine. I nodded, though my mind was anything but calm. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, flashing a smile that made my heart ache. "You couldn't stop me if you tried." That night as I lay in bed, my thoughts were consumed by the memory of his hands on my skin, the sound of his voice saying my name, and the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. It felt dangerous. It felt wrong, but it was also the most alive I had felt in years. The following evening, Mitchell arrived unexpectedly. I had just wrapped up the dinner cleanup, the house enveloped in a serene silence, broken only by the soft whir of the dishwasher. When I opened the door, I found him standing there, his hair tousled by the breeze. A familiar rush surged in my chest. "You didn't call," I said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. "I didn't think I needed to," he replied, his voice steady yet laced with an undertone that sent a shiver down my spine. He held up a bottle of wine, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thought you might like some company." I hesitated, my fingers gripping the door frame tightly, but the truth was I didn't want to be alone, not tonight. "I'll grab some glasses," I said, leading him into the kitchen. We settled in the living room, the wine bottle resting between us on the coffee table. Mitchell poured the first glass for me, his movements slow and intentional. The way he looked at me as he handed it over made my heart race. "What are we toasting to?" I asked, my voice wavering. He leaned back on the couch, glass in hand, and offered a small, knowing smile. "To honesty," he said simply. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his gaze. "Honesty," I echoed, raising my glass. We drank in silence for a while, the soft glow of the lamp casting warm shadows on the walls. I tried to distract myself with anything but him, the ticking clock, the gentle rustle of the wind outside, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. "You're quiet tonight," he remarked, breaking the stillness. "I'm just tired," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. "Liar," he said softly, his tone playful, but his eyes were serious. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "Mitchell, don't push me away," he interrupted gently. His words lingered in the air, heavy and unyielding. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly, and when I met his gaze, the vulnerability in his expression unraveled me. "I'm not trying to push you away," I spoke softly, unsure of how to express my feelings. He leaned in closer, urging me to clarify. "What is it, Juliet? Tell me." I hesitated, the words stuck in my throat, but his unwavering gaze made it impossible to ignore the truth we both recognized. "It's something I can't overlook," I finally confessed. "Then don't," he replied simply. Before I could reconsider, he reached across the distance, his hand enveloping mine. The warmth of his touch sent a jolt through me, and I gasped as his thumb traced gentle circles over my knuckles. "You're allowed to want this," he murmured, his honesty breaking down my defenses. Without thinking, I leaned in, our lips meeting in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened. Mitchell didn't hold back. His hand found the back of my neck, drawing me closer, and I surrendered completely. The world around us faded away, leaving only the heat of his touch, the softness of his lips, and an exhilarating sense of being alive. Somehow we found ourselves in my bedroom, though I couldn't recall how we got there, only the way his hand moved over me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. He paused, resting his forehead against mine, and whispered, "Are you sure?" I nodded, gripping his shirt tightly as if to ground myself. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. What followed was a whirlwind of warmth and connection, each kiss and touch weaving a tapestry of intimacy that left no room for doubt. Mitchell was patient and attentive, and the way he looked at me, as if I were the center of his universe, brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in years I felt truly seen, deeply understood. Afterward, we lay entwined beneath the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Mitchell's arm rested comfortably around my waist, his fingers lazily tracing patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head nestled against his chest. I think so, I replied, though my mind was a chaotic storm of emotions I couldn't quite articulate. You don't have to make any decisions right now, he reassured me, his lips brushing against my temple. Just know that I'm here for you no matter what. His words brought tears to my eyes, and I squeezed them shut, trying to hold on to this moment for as long as possible. But as the first light of dawn seeped into the room, reality began to settle in, the weight of our actions pressing down on me like a heavy stone. Questions swirled in my mind, impossible to ignore. When Mitchell stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open, he smiled gently, his hand brushing against my cheek. "Good morning," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice quivering slightly. He seemed to sense my unease, his smile fading as he searched my eyes. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Later, as I stood by the window watching him drive away, the house felt eerily quiet, more so than ever before. I wrapped my arms around myself, the memory of his touch still vivid on my skin. I realized we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the weight of that truth was almost suffocating. Yet, beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a flicker of hope, fragile but persistent. For the first time in years, I felt like I was on the brink of something new, something terrifying yet wonderful. The day after I struggled to focus, my hands trembled as I folded laundry, the sensation of Mitchell's touch still fresh against my skin. Every room in the house echoed with his presence, and my mind replayed every moment from the night before. I had crossed a threshold I never thought I would, and while part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't experienced in ages, the reality of it all loomed large. The weight of guilt and uncertainty had been absent from my life for years, but now it felt like a heavy stone pressing down on me. When my phone buzzed on the counter, I nearly dropped the shirt I was holding in surprise. "Mitchell, can I see you later?" The message made my heart race. A part of me wanted to decline, to take a moment to think and breathe, but the memory of his gaze made it impossible to say no. He arrived that evening as the sun sank below the horizon. I opened the door to find him standing there, his expression calm yet serious. "Hi," I said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "Hi," he replied, his voice equally quiet. We stood in silence for a moment, the air between us thick but not uncomfortable. Finally, Mitchell broke the stillness. "Are you okay?" he asked, searching my eyes. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I feel conflicted." "I get that," he said, stepping closer. "But I don't regret it, not for a second." His honesty tightened my chest, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Mitchell, this is so complicated," I whispered. "Only if we let it be," he replied, his voice steady. We settled onto the couch, and Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Talk to me," he urged. "Tell me what you're thinking." I hesitated, twisting my hands in my lap. "I'm scared," I finally admitted. "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of everything," I said, my voice breaking. "Of what people will think, of what this means, of losing you." "You're not going to lose me," he said firmly, covering my hand with his. "I'm here, Juliet. I'm not going anywhere." The certainty in his voice brought tears to my eyes. "How can you be so sure?" I whispered. "Because I know what I want," he said simply. "And I want you." Before I could respond, Mitchell reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek with a tenderness that took my breath away. "You don't have to make any decisions right now," he spoke gently. "But there's no need for you to push me away." His words shattered something within me, and before I could think twice, I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "I don't know how to navigate this," I whispered. "We'll figure it out," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "Together." When his lips met mine, the kiss was slow and intentional, as if he were silently reassuring me. His hands found their way to my waist, drawing me closer, and I surrendered completely. The outside world faded away, leaving just the warmth of his embrace and the steady beat of his heart against mine. We moved in sync just like the night before, but this time it felt different, more intentional, more assured. Each kiss, each caress reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to bear my doubts alone. Afterward, we lay entwined on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting gentle shadows on the walls. Mitchell's arm rested over my shoulders, his fingers tracing soothing patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice a calming balm. I nodded, my head nestled against his chest. "I think so," I replied, though my mind was still a storm of feelings. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "We'll take it one step at a time." His words were meant to soothe me, but the gravity of what we had done was hard to ignore. The days that followed were a blend of quiet moments and unspoken tension. Mitchell continued to come by, his presence a steady source of comfort. Yet as much as I cherished having him close, I couldn't shake the anxiety that gnawed at me. What if someone discovered us? What would others think? One evening as we sat on the porch, Mitchell turned to me, his expression serious. I had been mulling over his words, feeling a tightness in my chest as I considered what it all meant for us. I turned my gaze away, my fingers nervously intertwining in my lap. "It's not that simple, Mitchell," I replied softly. "It can be," he countered, "if we allow it." His words lingered in my mind long after he left that evening. Deep down I recognized he was right. My fear was the only barrier between us, yet releasing that fear felt like an impossible leap, akin to jumping off a cliff without knowing if there would be a safety net below. The next time Mitchell visited, he didn't come with groceries or tools. Instead, he brought a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "What do you want, Juliet?" he asked, his voice steady yet brimming with emotion. "Not what you think you should want, but what do you truly desire?" The simplicity of his question contrasted sharply with the complexity of my feelings. I looked at him, my heart racing as I struggled to articulate my thoughts. "I don't know," I finally admitted. "Then figure it out," he urged, his hand enveloping mine. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'll wait as long as it takes." As he drove away that night, I stood by the window, watching his truck fade into the distance. The house felt eerily silent, and the weight of his words wrapped around me like a heavy shroud. I was uncertain about what I wanted, but I realized I could no longer evade the truth. The morning after Mitchell's visit, I awoke to a still house. The sunlight filtering through the curtains felt unusually warm, yet it did little to lift the heaviness in my heart. His question echoed in my mind. "What do you actually want?" For years, I had lived my life according to others' expectations. First as Bill's wife, then as the stepmother who held the family together after his death. But in Mitchell's eyes and his words, I sensed a challenge to break free from those limitations. The dilemma was whether I had the courage to take that leap. I spent the day immersed in household tasks, trying to stave off the inevitable spiral of doubt and fear that loomed over me. The memories of the past week kept flooding my mind. How Mitchell's hands felt when they brushed against mine, the softness in his voice as he offered me comfort, and the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered in his world. By the time the sun sank below the horizon, I had reached my limit. I couldn't remain in this uncertain space any longer. I picked up my phone and called Mitchell. He picked up on the first ring. "Juliet," he said, his voice calm but tinged with concern. "Can you come over?" I asked, my voice quivering slightly. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he replied without a moment's hesitation. True to his word, Mitchell arrived swiftly. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes searching mine. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone steady yet gentle. "Nothing," I replied softly, stepping back to let him in. I needed to see you." Relief washed over his face, and he nodded, a faint smile appearing. "I'm here." We moved to the living room, where he settled beside me on the couch, our knees brushing against each other. The closeness felt comforting, grounding me, and for the first time in days I could finally breathe. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice barely a whisper. Mitchell turned to me, his gaze focused and intent. "And you're right," I admitted, my throat tightening. "I've spent so much time worrying about what others think, about what's right and wrong, that I've forgotten to ask myself what I truly want." His hand found mine, fingers intertwining in a simple yet profound gesture that made my heart ache. "And what do you want?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath, my heart racing. "I want this," I said, my voice trembling. "I want you, but I'm scared, Mitchell. I don't know how to navigate this." "We'll figure it out," he assured me, his voice steady and comforting. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of my confession hanging between us. Then Mitchell leaned in, resting his forehead against mine. He whispered, "You're not alone. You don't have to face this by yourself. The tears I had been holding back finally flowed, and I shut my eyes, allowing the weight of his words to envelop me. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of releasing the guilt, the fear, and the expectations that had burdened me. When I opened my eyes, Mitchell was gazing at me, his expression sincere and open. "I'll follow your lead," he said gently. "Whatever you choose, I'm here for you." That evening, as we sat together on the couch, it dawned on me that the answer to Mitchell's question had always been within reach. What I truly desired wasn't just his presence. It was the freedom to live life on my own terms and to embrace the love that had been quietly blossoming between us, no matter how unconventional it might appear here. I had no idea what the future would bring, but for the first time in ages, I felt unafraid to discover it. A week later, Mitchell proposed a weekend getaway for just the two of us, calling it a fresh start. His eyes sparkling with hope. I hesitated initially, the weight of my doubts still heavy. But as I looked into his steady gaze, a spark of courage ignited within me. "Okay," I finally replied, and his smile lit up the room. The way he wrapped his arms around me made my heart feel lighter than it had in years. On the day we were set to leave, I stood by the window, watching Mitchell load the car. The house was quiet, but this time the silence felt comforting. As I stepped outside, the sun warmed my skin, and a sense of hope surged through me, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Mitchell opened the car door for me, his smile gentle yet full of promise. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded, my heart tight with both excitement and possibility. "Let's go," I said, climbing into the car and fastening my seatbelt. This time I didn't need him to make everything right.